Sandwalker recruits mock human combat trials, then fled screaming when the footage began. When the footage started, half the room collapsed. Some ran, others cried, and one vomited. These were the best cadets of the Sandwalker program, elite warriors bred on cartoon. But nothing in their training had prepared them for the raw terror of watching how humans fight, and why they never stop. It began with laughter, mocking human war as primitive. It ended in silence and transformation. Before we reveal the moment they broke, hit subscribe and drop a comment if you're ready for sci-fi stories that cut deeper than plasma blades. Your support brings more human versus galaxy tales to life. Stories of pain, memory, and what it means to endure. At the heart of this story is Captain Leena Ward, a human relic with no weapons, no entourage, and one haunting holodisc. The cadets mocked her, but by the time they discovered who she truly was, it was too late to look away. What followed wasn't just a lesson, it was a reckoning. Let's go back to where it began, to the scorched planet of cartoon, where arrogance met memory and fear finally learned its name. The twin suns of cartoon cast a molten glare across the sandstone barracks as the Sandwalker recruits assemble for their briefing. Their mandibles clicked in lazy rhythm, antennae twitching with disinterest. The humans were late again, they joked, or perhaps too weak to traverse the dunes. Krazor, the squad's loudest and most decorated cadet, leaned back against a scorched pillar, his blue exoskeleton gleaming under the heat. Another human lecture, he muttered, probably about how they survive using sticks and panic. The other cadets laughed, unaware of the figure walking silently behind them. Leena Ward stepped onto the elevated platform without announcement. Her boots, worn and dirt-stained, made no sound. Her uniform was different from the regulation human armor they were used to seeing, old, patched, with a crimson insignia on the shoulder that no one could identify. She scanned the group with calm detachment, her gaze meeting Krazor's mocking smirk with an unreadable expression. Behind her followed no entourage, no translator, no tech. Just a simple holodisc clipped to her belt and a pulse barely above resting. Stillness. Control. Krazor whispered to his neighbor, "Is this the relic they sent us?" One human fossil to teach a battalion. More laughter. The cadence of their arrogance echoed across the assembly, like a war drum played in reverse. Each beat not summoning courage, but dismissing it. Leena didn't flinch. She remained frozen, like a sculpture carved from command. One cadet, Mikar, shifted uncomfortably as her presence stretched beyond her silence. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, like standing before a monument whose history you forgot to respect. Then she spoke. "You laugh because you believe your enemies must be smaller than your armor." Her voice was low, precise, and carried no theatrics. It cut through the desert air like a scalpel, clean and deliberate. But what if strength isn't what you carry on your back, but what you carry when everyone else has died? A brief hush fell, the kind of silence that doesn't come from reverence, but confusion. Krazor leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. Mikar's gaze locked with hers, his instincts flickering like static. Leena pulled the holodisc from her belt and activated it midair. A flicker, then a holographic interface spun open. Cold blue overlays, red blinking seals, a file marked visual training, red level, restricted. Gasps and half-suppressed grunts followed. The recruits weren't used to humans handling technology with such confidence, let alone unlocking files they themselves were told were forbidden. Krazor stood upright now, arms crossed. "You think showing us your primitive battles will impress us?" he asked. "We've seen creatures bleed. We've made them." The crowd chuckled again. Leena didn't answer. Instead, she turned to face projection, now paused on a distorted image. A charred building, a bloody child, and a soldier dragging another through rubble. No context. No warning. "You'll see," she said softly, "not what humans are, but why we never stop." Her words landed like flares, illuminating and alarming. Mikar stepped slightly forward without realizing it. Something pulled him. Not the image, but the weight in her voice. There was grief there, not simulated, not procedural, personal. A sudden gust of desert wind swept across the platform, scattering sand like ashes around her boots. The silence returned, this time heavier. Krazor's mocking tone faltered for just a second. "This is a game, right?" he said, half to himself. "Just a test." No answer came, only the flickering of red seal files behind her. A few cadets began to shift uncomfortably. The platform, once a stage for mockery, had become an altar, and Leena, the relic, had become a mirror. The commanding officer of the training base, Calhoun, observed from a tower above, arms folded. He said nothing, but made a single mark on his tablet. Phase 1 initiated. He had warned them this lesson would be necessary, not to prepare them for combat, but to prepare them for humans, the kind of enemy that doesn't retreat when outnumbered, the kind of ally that becomes lethal when abandoned, and the kind of soldier who carries every scar as a reason to rise again. Leena closed the interface and let the silence stretch. "Tomorrow," she said, "you will watch what made us." No theatrics, no threat, only certainty. Then she stepped down, leaving cadets to process her presence in the dust she left behind. Mikar was still watching her. Krazor was still trying to laugh. But neither succeeded. The following day, the cadets assembled again, but this time with a different posture. Less laughter, more skepticism. They were still smug, but now cautious. A wide holoscreen hovered midair, displaying the title Historical Combat Archives, Human Species. Krazor barked a quick joke to lighten the atmosphere. Maybe we'll see them using sharpened bones this time. Laughter returned, but was thinner than before, like a veil trying to cover unease. Mikar sat near the edge of the group, his gaze flicking between the screen and Leena, who stood silently beside it. The footage began with curated clips of 21st century Earth wars, metal tanks rolling through cities, helicopters launching missiles, trench warfare in muddy fields. The cadets laughed at the outdated technology, mimicking human screams with exaggerated gestures. No armor fields, no hive tactics, just blind rushes. One of them mocked. Krazor added, "This isn't battle, it's ritual suicide." The tone in the room rose again, their confidence swelling with each passing second of human foolishness. Leena remained motionless, her face unreadable. She made no attempt to correct their assumptions. Instead, she let the footage roll, each scene growing more chaotic. Civilians evacuating, buildings collapsing, soldiers crawling through dust and fire. Mikar's antennae twitched involuntarily. Something in the footage felt off. Not the visuals, but the eyes of the humans, the way they looked at each other under fire, the way they moved despite wounds. There was no coordination, no elegance, just something raw and unbearable. Why don't they retreat? Mikar finally whispered. It wasn't challenge. It was a genuine question, spoken too softly for anyone but Leena to hear. She didn't reply, but her eyes shifted just slightly toward him, acknowledging the crack in the wall. Krazor heard it too. "Because they're too primitive to know when they've lost," he answered, louder with a sneer. "They mistake desperation for courage." His voice was confident, but only on the surface. Suddenly, a new interface flickered on the side of the screen. Level 3 clearance required, red level. Confidential. The file pulsed in a deeper shade of red. The cadets leaned forward. Krazor narrowed his eyes. "Now that looks interesting," he muttered. One cadet tapped on it, but was denied access. "Locked?" he asked. "Why show us if we can't open it?" Leena finally moved, stepping forward with deliberate calm. "Because you haven't earned the right to see what humans fear," she said, voice cold. The room shifted. The tone darkened. Jokes stopped. The idea that there were things humans feared enough to classify unsettled them. One cadet barked. "Fear is a weakness. If you're proud of it, why hide it?" Leena responded without raising her voice. "We don't hide it to protect ourselves. We hide it to protect you." Mikar visibly flinched at those words. There was something deeper here, something sacred that they were mocking without knowing the cost. Leena hovered her wrist over the locked file. A biometric scan. A pause. Then access granted. The icon turned green. The screen dimmed, shifting into a new color palette. Darker, grainier, raw. A countdown began. Warning. Distress content. Viewer discretion advised. A tension filled the air that no armor could deflect. Krayzor crossed his arms but said nothing. The others straightened, silent, alert. Mikar's hands trembled slightly on his knees. Just before the footage played, Leena looked at them one last time. You mocked us because you saw only how we fought. Now you'll see why we keep fighting. The words dropped like iron, and then the screen went black. For 2 seconds, long enough for the silence to scream. The first frames hadn't even started, but something had already changed. They were no longer watching to laugh. They were bracing to understand, or to be broken. And then the footage began. The footage opened with static and a date. Fallujah Earth Campaign, 2131. No music, no narration, just handheld recording, shaky and frantic. The first image was a soldier, human burned, bleeding from the scalp, dragging a wounded ally across broken glass while gunfire erupted overhead. A sudden explosion engulfed part of the frame, and the sound of the soldiers breathing, ragged and loud, filled the chamber. The cadets flinched in unison. Even Krayzor's arms slowly dropped to his sides. The next sequence showed a squadron of humans cornered inside a collapsed building. One soldier, no more than 20, cried while loading ammunition, fingers trembling. A commander slapped his shoulder and shouted something unintelligible. The boy nodded and ran outside, weapon drawn, into a storm of plasma fire. The camera followed as he collapsed beside 2 alien corpses, still firing with his last breath. Mikar covered his mouth. "Why didn't they pull him back?" he whispered. No one answered. Then came the Arctic Inferno. A battalion of humans, underequipped and frostbitten, charging across white tundra as aerial drones bombarded their path. One soldier, legs nearly frozen, refused extraction. He strapped a detonation pack to his chest and sprinted through fire toward a tunnel swarming with enemies. He screamed something in English before vanishing in a plume of blue. The shockwave blurred the lens, but not enough to hide the eyes of those left behind. No victory, just the silence of survival. The cadets were no longer seated. Some had risen unconsciously. Krayzor stared with locked jaw, mandibles twitching, while his hands curled into fists. Another cadet muttered, "This isn't war. It's madness." Leena remained silent, arms behind her back, letting the footage speak. Her expression didn't change, but her breathing deepened slightly. These were memories, not propaganda. These were ghosts she brought with her, not for glory, but for truth. A child, maybe 12, crawled out of rubble carrying a pistol too large for her hands. She fired once, missed, and was hit by debris. The soldier next to her didn't run. He covered her body with his own and died shielding her. The screen froze for 3 seconds on their bodies. Some cadets turned away. Mikar sobbed quietly. The footage continued without apology, showing battlefield medics stitching limbs in the mud while under fire, and soldiers screaming prayers, curses, and names into the void. Suddenly, the projection shifted. A single close-up clip. A human woman, eyes swollen, face burned, whispering into a comm. "If this gets through, tell them we didn't fall. We stood." She then sprinted toward a large alien nest, holding a charge in both hands. She was on fire, and as she jumped, the video slowed. Mikar gasped. Krayzor's eyes widened. The woman was Leena. The clip cut before impact. Silence followed, a different kind of silence. The realization dawned slowly, like frostbite. Leena had lived this. She wasn't showing them someone else's pain. She was reliving her own. Krayzor stepped backward. "You!" he murmured, unable to finish. The cadets who had mocked her now stared like they were in the presence of a revenant. Not a woman, but a legend who had bled and burned for a cause none of them could name. The air grew thick with something unspoken, reverence. One cadet dropped to his knees. Another walked out without saying a word. Mikar looked directly at Leena now, his eyes no longer questioning, just broken. "You jumped while on fire." Leena didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence was heavier than any speech. Krayzor clenched his fist again, but not in arrogance. This time it was shame and confusion. The walls of his certainty were beginning to collapse. The screen faded to black. In that void, Leena finally spoke, Now you know what we are, what we carry, and what it costs. No one laughed. No one moved. They had mocked fire, and now they had been scorched. And the next challenge hadn't even begun. The silence after the footage ended was deeper than before. It wasn't empty. It was charged, like a battlefield after the smoke settles, but before the wounded begin to scream. Some cadets remained frozen, their gazes locked on the dead screen, as if it might flicker back to life and punish them again. One recruit stood up, stumbled, and ran out of the hall without a word. Another tried to compose himself, only to collapse into his seat, trembling. Mikar hadn't moved. His eyes were wide, but not blank. They were processing. Krasor, usually the loudest, stood stiffly, jaw clenched so tightly that small cracks formed along his lower mandibles. His chest rose and fell in rapid bursts, and for the first time, he looked less like a warrior and more like a boy. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to insult, to justify, or to command, but nothing came out. The words dissolved in his throat. His pride had no defense against what he had seen. And worse, it had no way to explain it. Leena didn't address them. She turned off the projection and simply stood there. Her silence, once mistaken for weakness, now echoed louder than any reprimand. The cadets had witnessed what she had endured, and no uniform, no rank, could separate her from the soldier who burned alive to save others. Mikar finally stood. His legs wobbled slightly, but his eyes never left Leena. "Why didn't you scream?" he asked. The question broke something in the room. "I did," Leena replied quietly, "just not out loud." That answer hit harder than the footage. It revealed a deeper truth, that real pain doesn't always come with sound. Sometimes it burrows deep into the bones and never leaves. Several cadets sat back down, ashamed. Their laughter from the day before now echoed in memory, like an act of cruelty they wished they could erase. The bravado that had once defined them had turned to dust. Then came the formal breaking point. One by one, cadets walked to the front of the room, placed their enlistment insignias on the table, and left. No words, no explanation, just resignation. Krasor watched them go, fists still clenched, but he didn't follow. Not yet. His world had been shattered, but something inside him refused to run. Whether it was pride or awakening, even he didn't know. Mikar approached the table too, but paused. Instead of resigning, he knelt. He placed his hand over the human insignia engraved on the holodisc case and whispered, "I won't run from what I don't understand." It wasn't a pledge of loyalty. It was a vow to confront the unknown. Leena's eyes softened just enough to be noticed. She stepped forward and placed a hand on Mikar's shoulder. "That's where true courage begins," she said. A flicker of warmth passed between them. Fragile but real. Krasor watched the exchange and turned away, walking toward the exit. Everyone expected him to leave, to follow the others, to escape the weight of his fractured identity. But at the threshold, he stopped. His fists loosened. He didn't turn around, but his voice carried. "You humans, you're not brave. You're broken, and you've learned to weaponize it." Leena didn't deny it. She let the truth settle on its own. That was the point. "I'll stay," Krasor added, barely audible. "But not because I believe in you. Because I need to know why I fear you now." He stepped back into the room, and though his posture was still rigid, the arrogance had gone. What replaced it wasn't humility. It was something deeper, reverence wrapped in confusion. Mikar looked up at him and offered a nod. Not of friendship, but of shared unrest. The old certainty had died, and something new was forming. Leena turned to the remaining cadets. Only half the original unit remained, but those who stayed carried something the others lacked. Not just knowledge, but transformation. "This wasn't the test," she said. "It was the threshold." Her words struck like thunder over cracked ground. Tomorrow, the real test would begin. But for now, the greatest battle had already been fought, and it had taken place inside each of them. At dawn, the remaining cadets stood silently on the training field, no longer exchanging boasts or idle chatter. The desert wind seemed to respect the shift in tone, blowing softly instead of roaring. Leena stood before them again, this time without projection equipment, without spectacle. Her voice, when it came, was softer than before, Not out of weakness, but reverence. What you saw yesterday was only what the camera could show. What it couldn't show is what we carry inside long after the war ends. She paced slowly before them, her hands behind her back, gaze drifting across the recruits who had chosen to stay. You asked why we keep fighting, she continued, eyes briefly locking with Mikar. Why we charge when wounded, when abandoned, when outnumbered. It's not because we are fearless. It's because we've lost too much to stop. Her voice cracked slightly, the first true sign of emotion since her arrival, and with it came a pause that wrapped around the group like a fog. Then she opened a small hollow emitter on her wrist. A single image flickered into view, a family photo. A woman, a man, 2 children smiling beside a rusted field vehicle. This was mine, she said. My family, evacuated before the siege of Vallis Prime. Her voice dropped. They never made it to orbit. The cadets shifted. Mikar looked down. Even Krazor's posture tightened. Loss was something they all understood. But this kind of loss, weaponized into perseverance, was new. Leena continued. After that transmission you saw, the one where I ran into the nest, I was presumed dead. I had no rank, no resources, just a broken transmitter and a combat knife. The room remained still. She wasn't boasting. She was remembering. For 6 days I crawled through snow and ash with shattered ribs and no food, tracking their command signal to destroy it. She turned to them now. That's what we mean by strength. Not muscles, not tech, endurance rooted in something personal. Krazor raised his voice, quieter than usual. But why? Why not let it go? If everything's gone, what's left to fight for? Leena didn't hesitate. Memory, she replied. Legacy. The idea that their death will mean something if I live long enough to carry it forward. And if I don't, someone else will. That's how humans survive, through meaning. The word hung in the air like smoke, elusive, painful, yet undeniably real. Mikar stepped forward, his voice trembling. That's why you didn't scream. Leena nodded. The scream stayed inside, because there was no one left to hear it. The cadets stood in silence, but their minds raced. They weren't just confronting another species anymore. They were confronting the possibility that resilience was not about strength. It was about grief channeled into action. The battlefield was no longer physical. It was existential. She approached the group slowly, no longer commander, but something more dangerous, a survivor with purpose. You fear our pain because it's unfamiliar. You think we're unstable. But pain is our oldest ally. It never leaves us, and it never lies. That's what makes us dangerous. Not our guns, not our ships, our ghosts. Mikar looked like he was about to cry again. Krazor lowered his head. Then came the line that shifted everything. Pain taught us to stand. Love taught us why. The cadence of her words struck like a mantra, awakening something buried. Several cadets looked at each other, unsure what to say, unsure if there was anything that could be said. The emotional terrain they were now standing on had no map. They were lost, and for the first time, they realized that was the beginning of transformation. Leena finished with a whisper. What you fear in us is what you never allowed yourselves to feel. With that, she stepped back and allowed the silence to speak again. No projection, no training exercise, just truth, raw and unresolved. And in that moment, they all understood. The most dangerous soldier wasn't the one who fought to win. It was the one who fought because losing meant forgetting. The training compound remained silent for a long time after Leena's final words. The cadets stood as if rooted in place, uncertain whether to salute, speak, or simply breathe. The heat of Khartoum's twin suns pressed down, but none of them noticed. Something heavier had settled over the field, the weight of understanding. Krazor looked around, searching for some signal, some confirmation that this wasn't weakness. But the silence itself had become the answer. Then Mikar moved. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward and removed the emblem from his uniform, not in surrender, but reverently. He approached Leena and knelt, pressing the symbol against his own chest before holding it out to her. Not to pledge, he said, voice cracking, but to remember. The gesture wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't military. It was something older, ancestral. The act of honoring what could not be explained, only felt. Leena accepted it with both hands. A second cadet followed, then a third. None spoke. Each repeated the gesture, creating a silent ritual of recognition. What began as mockery had become ceremony. Krayzor stood still, arms tense, watching as the squad dismantled its old beliefs and built something new with bare hands and broken pride. He stepped forward, stopping short of the circle. He removed his emblem, but didn't offer it. Instead, he dropped it at Leena's feet. "I mocked you because I thought fear was shame," he said. "But I was afraid before I even met you." Leena didn't speak. She bent, picked up the emblem, and placed it gently into Krayzor's open palm. "Fear is only shameful when you lie about it," she said. That line didn't land like a lesson. It landed like a mercy. Krayzor bowed his head for the first time, not to follow, but to listen. The shift was complete. The bravado had been burned away, and in its place stood something rarer than loyalty, respect born from terror. The base commander, Calrun, observed from above once again. He had said nothing for days, but now he transmitted a short message to the Central Command. Phase 2 exceeded expectations. The human method is unstable, but effective. He watched as the cadets formed a loose circle around Leena, not in formation, but in reverence, not out of obedience, but because they had nowhere else to stand after what they had seen. They were no longer recruits. They were witnesses. Later that evening, a small fire burned in the courtyard, not part of training protocol. It had been lit by the cadets themselves. No orders, no drills, just silent figures sitting around flames, sharing the same space where they had once sat in arrogance. Leena stood at a distance, watching. She didn't intrude. She didn't need to. Her presence was already part of the firelight, a constant reminder of what they had confronted. Mikar looked up at her and gestured. She approached slowly and sat, the crackling fire reflecting off her old armor. "Tell us something we don't know about your people," he asked. Leena paused, then smiled faintly. "We dance after funerals," she said. The cadets stared, not because we forget, but because we refuse to let the pain take everything. A few nodded. Krayzor closed his eyes. The idea disturbed him, and yet it made sense. A shared silence returned, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of grief, of respect, of something forming in the ashes of humiliation and truth. Leena looked around the circle, no longer seeing strangers. "Tomorrow we begin live simulations," she said. "You won't be fighting humans, but you'll carry them with you, in how you move, in what you fear, and in who you protect." No one objected. They were ready, not for battle, but for meaning. As the fire dwindled into embers, Krayzor whispered into the night, almost to himself. "We thought we were the only ones who bled honor." Leena heard him, but didn't reply. She didn't have to. They had already learned that some truths are better left unsaid, because they live longer that way. Dawn broke over Khartoum's red cliffs as the simulation chamber powered to life. The cadets stood in full gear, faces tense but no longer brash. There were no wisecracks, no swagger, just anticipation, and the weight of everything they had learned. Leena stood beside Commander Calrun, both silent as the last system checks ran. "Today," Calrun announced, "you enter the Crucible, a real-time combat simulation where tactics, choices, and emotional stressors would determine survival. It wasn't a drill. It was the closest thing to war without dying." The chamber's interior shimmered as the neural grid activated. Walls vanished, revealing a battlefield reconstruction of Valus Prime, the very place where Leena had once lost everything. Hills scarred by shell impacts, fires still smoldering in false ruins. The cadets would face enemy drones programmed to mimic real alien insurgents. But more dangerous than the drones was a psychological profile coded into the sim: grief triggers, moral dilemmas, helpless civilians, and battlefield failures. This was no test of strength. It was a test of conviction. Mikar was the first to enter. His movements were measured, but he carried his weapon like someone who no longer sought victory, only purpose. Krayzor hesitated at the threshold. His jaw tightened as the scene unfolded. As his HUD blinked into view, he saw it, a wounded cadet lying near a collapsed wall, reaching for help while enemy fire tore through the air. His squad leader shouted to press forward. Logic said leave the wounded. Instinct said survive. But his gut, his fear, his memory, said go back. He froze. 1 second. 2. The sound of simulated screams grew louder. His weapon shook in his grip. He thought of Leena, on fire, running into the nest. Thought of Mikar, kneeling in silence. Thought of how his voice had failed when it mattered most. Not again, he muttered. Then he ran, not forward, but backward toward the downed cadet. He slid beside the wounded figure, fired into shadows, and lifted him over his shoulders. Leena watched from the control deck, eyes locked on Krazor's icon. The operator beside her spoke. He broke formation. Leena responded without looking away. He broke pride. Her fingers hovered over the override button, but didn't press it. This was what they were here to see. Not just performance, but transformation under pressure. Mikar, in another quadrant, was already forming a makeshift perimeter around a group of simulated civilians. He barked orders, not to dominate, but to protect. The system began adjusting. The more empathy shown, the more difficult the scenarios became. The software read their moral choices and escalated consequences. A friendly fire situation emerged. A decision between saving one cadet or many. The recruits hesitated, adapted, and broke down, but not like before. They didn't run. They stayed, fought, and screamed when needed. Not out of panic, out of refusal to surrender their humanity. Krazor reached the evac zone, carrying the wounded cadet, exhausted and bleeding from shrapnel wounds sustained in the simulation. He collapsed behind a barricade and looked up at the sky projected above. Stars fake, but the ache in his limbs real. Did I pass? He muttered. The simulation froze. Not by command, by design. The screen cut to black. Outside the chamber, Leena stood slowly. In the observation room, the silence was as thick as it had been during the footage. Calrun nodded once. He chose wrong by protocol, he said, but he chose right by memory. Leena's expression didn't change, but her eyes closed briefly, as if offering a moment of silent respect. Not just for the simulation, but for the boy who had finally stopped trying to be a soldier and had become something else entirely. Back inside the chamber, Krazor opened his eyes, but the world was gone. Static surrounded him. No battlefield. No enemy. Just white light. A voice echoed through the room, his own, recorded earlier. I mocked you because I thought fear was shame. Then silence. He reached for his weapon, but it wasn't there, just a breath in his lungs. And the uncertainty of what comes after awakening. Days later, the simulation center stood quiet, its sandblasted walls bearing witness to what had transpired inside. A new banner hung over the compound entrance, not a flag of victory, but patch torn from Leena Ward's old uniform, stitched with the symbol of her fallen unit. It wasn't official, and yet no one dared remove it. To the cadets who remained, it wasn't decoration. It was memory. A reminder that transformation wasn't given. It was earned in fire. Mikar now led training patrols across Cardoon's terrain. His movements were sharp but not rigid. His commands were calm, not loud. He carried himself like someone who had been broken and rebuilt with intention. The younger recruits respected him instantly, though most didn't know why. He never spoke of what he had seen in the footage, but in his eyes it lived not as trauma, but as compass. Every step he took was a silent answer to the question, what will you do when it's your turn to carry someone? Krazor hadn't spoken much since the simulation ended. He didn't need to. His actions became his language. He volunteered for the most grueling drills, not to prove strength, but to unlearn weakness. Not physical weakness, the kind that hides behind mockery. His former bravado had been scorched from him, and what remained was stripped down resolve. He never asked to lead, but when a new recruit faltered in the trenches, it was Krazor who pulled him out, without a word. Leena prepared to leave. Her assignment was over. Her presence had achieved what no curriculum ever could. As she walked the compound one last time, cadets nodded to her in silent reverence. Not one saluted. They knew she wouldn't want it. In her quarters, she left behind a small data chip. It contained the footage they had seen, plus one more file, locked and labeled, "Use only when memory fades." On the back, a handwritten note, "What hurts, you may one day save them." At sunset, Mikar and Krazor stood beside her transport. "Where will you go now?" Mikar asked. Leena smiled faintly. "Wherever ghosts still walk." Krazor, staring at the horizon, added, "Then you'll never run out of ground." Leena looked at him for a moment, not as a commander, but as an equal. "That's the point." She stepped onto the ramp, and without fanfare, vanished into the ship's hold. No speech, no farewell, just departure, as quiet as her arrival. Later that night, the cadets gathered around the fire again. The ritual now theirs to keep. They spoke not of weapons or tactics, but what they feared, of who they had become, and who they still didn't understand. They didn't cry. They didn't boast. They remembered, because remembrance was no longer a human thing. It was theirs too, now. They had seen the line between strength and sorrow, and stepped over it. The next cycle brought new recruits. Loud, arrogant, untested. One mocked the fire pit, called it primitive. Mikar didn't scold him. He simply handed the recruit a file. "Watch this first," he said. "Then we'll train." The recruit rolled his eyes, but later that night, he was seen sitting alone by the fire, quiet. The chain had begun again. Not a command, but a memory passed down like flame, never loud, always burning. Above the compound, stars blinked into the desert sky. Somewhere beyond them, the real war still raged. But the cadets of Khartoum would face it differently now. They didn't fear pain. They understood its shape. They didn't seek glory. They sought meaning. And they didn't mock the human legacy anymore, because now they carried it, in silence, in fire, in the way they stood when everything else collapsed. So if you ever see a soldier kneeling where others would run, or standing where there's no hope left, ask not what weapon they carry, but what memory. Because sometimes the strongest warriors are not the ones who survive, but the ones who endure broken and rise again. And that is what makes them human. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of what it means to endure, to remember, and to rise, subscribe to this channel and leave a comment about the moment that hit you the hardest. Your support helps us bring more stories that ignite purpose and courage. Become a channel member to support our mission and unlock exclusive stories that dive even deeper into the emotional heart of sci-fi and HFY narratives. More stories like this are already on the way. Don't miss our next revelation.